Welcome back to another exciting episode of the Social Web TV. And there is a lot to cover this week, and we've got a special guest from Ma.gnolia, Larry Halff. Welcome.
Hello.
And in honor, the Plaxo twins are sporting the swag that we got.
Independently had the same good idea. These, of course, the collector's item from the famous...
Actually, it seemed like a good idea until I saw you this morning. But
the famous spaghetti factory debacle of 2008.
There'll be a lot to talk about with Larry and the gang about user-generated content in the social web. But first in the news, in fact, a number of items that relate directly to that. And first up, the biggest news story, you've already seen it in news outlets like CNN and other smaller ones. Facebook Terms of Service, or TOS, in the news because of a change that got rolled back. And
That's
Chris,
right.
You want to tell us a little bit what's going on there?
So it turns out that Facebook actually changed their Terms of Service, which all of the members agreed to, in early February. And it wasn't until about earlier this week that the consumerists picked this up and essentially, blogged about how, well, now Facebook wants to keep your data forever. And essentially what was removed was a statement that Facebook previously had in their terms that said that you can always delete your account and all of your data. The problem with that is where we're going with the web, and we'll actually talk about this later, is that deleting all of your data from a service gets increasingly difficult as we move to cloud computing. And so,
and more sharing.
And more sharing. And as people get more comfortable with sharing and doing more of it. And so I think that there's an opportunity here to really dig into that issue and why these terms of services are really important to the use of Facebook and other services, but how the legal situation around this becomes much more interesting over time.
There's at least a couple of different angles that are interesting to pursue on this. One is social web is going so mainstream that this is big news story and people are really passionate. The other angle here is lawyers can really mess things up. And I think the real story of what Facebook is trying to do is a lot easier to tell from some of the blog posts that Mark has put out in our conversation when we had Dave and Luke from Facebook on the show last week, which was kind of an epic moment because behind us now, again, is the Bill of Rights for users of the social web, which is all about this stuff. And
Right.
Dave and Luke were enthusiastic signers of it. So I think Facebook really is trying to find their way to this kind of subtle thing, which is how do you empower users to share and have control, but still let the data flow in the way that it naturally must flow without DRM. So-
Right. I mean, I think this is like Facebook, because Facebook is so big and such generates news itself. This is a problem, not a problem, but this is an issue, an education issue that's existed, going back to RSS. The first APIs in RSS, from when you could push user-generated content, stuff that you were making out, and other people could grab it and keep it, and they could hold on to it. And even if you deleted your blog, even if you deleted your LiveJournal account, even if you deleted your accounts other places, your trail would still exist out there in some form.
And I think it's no surprise that as not only Facebook gets bigger, but they're trying to do more and more integration with the rest of the web through things like Facebook Connect and so forth. You really hit up against these issues of I've shared my data with you, or I've shared my data out to another service that I'm using, and there's just no good way to put the genie back in the bottle, but how do you strike that right balance of making users feel in control and yet sort of dealing with the realities that this sort of interoperability and sharing is useful and ultimately not something you can totally control from a central point.
Cool. Second story in the news also is about sharing user-generated content and controls around that. YouTube has just come out with a Creative Commons licensing option.
So it's sort of interesting where we're talking about how lawyers can really screw things up. But lawyers are also part of the solution, where those who are both forward-thinking and desirous of serving, I think, individual users' interests and helping people have both better control, but also the ability to free their data if they choose, can help move these things forward. And for a long time, YouTube has not had Creative Commons licensing, which means that people essentially have to license their content under the YouTube license, which essentially says that any YouTube member can reuse YouTube content however they choose within the YouTube service, or at least that's my understanding of it. Recently, they started allowing people to download videos from YouTube for offline viewing or things like that. And what they decided, I believe, is because they're charging for some of these downloads, is that if you are a member of YouTube and you want to make your data available for other people to use, you can specify whether or not you want your data to be reused or usable in a commercial context or not. And Creative Commons is all about allowing people to share their data to other people and allow other people to remix and reuse that content without necessarily asking for permission. So it's sort of a forward-looking way of allowing other people to reuse your stuff without getting permission if they're not going to use it for commercial purposes.
Is this, do we know if this is Google's first toe dip into the world of Creative Commons? I don't know of any other Google properties that have Creative
good
Commons
question.
licensing.
That's a good question.
Yahoo had a cool search engine for you could search Creative Commons licensed stuff, and obviously Flickr has done
I know
Creative
that-
Commons,
that-
but it's interesting. Yeah,
right,
Google and others starting to figure that out.
Google tends to be a large supporter, I think, of Creative Commons, at least in principle. I don't know, for example, if Blogger supports Creative Commons or not. But this is, I think, from the perspective of an overall web conversation, YouTube adopting Creative Commons is a very big deal. And this is also something that I blogged about last fall with regards to the Obama addresses, weekly addresses. Because here you have essentially a government entity publishing content on the web, which arguably could be owned by or shared by the collective U.S. audience, the taxpayers. And if it were shared under a license like Creative Commons, then it could be reused, shared more easily in other contexts and things like that. So it's very, I think, exciting to see this happen. And again, it goes to how some legal institutions can actually help people share more freely and with a better understanding of what the consequences are.
Cool.
I also like how, just to finish it up, but Creative Commons is another one of these kind of grassroots projects that was started by forward-thinking people who wanted to build a better system, but had to sort of do it bottoms up, outside in. And so, like OpenID and these other sort of similar efforts, seeing that get really sort of more mainstream adoption, is really gratifying. It seems like it's definitely part of that whole movement.
It's a legal building block, essentially, for sharing.
Right. Yeah.
Cool. Our third story in the news also is related to sharing. Full disclosure, Joseph and I are from Plaxo, and this is a Plaxo news story. We just rolled out this morning a new jobs feature, which is an interesting way of mashing up social and job listings. And what that means is if you have a job you're trying to fill, you can post it, and this is through a partnership with Simply Hired. But where it gets interesting is you can then share that job out to any and all of your network. That could be your business network, it could be family, friends, all of the above. And then those folks can reshare it if they want to. Now, resharing isn't the most commonly used feature in our service, but that whole notion of resharing is powerful and also somewhat at odds around this user control thing, which is, retweeting is very popular, but resharing of stuff within a social network is another area interesting to discuss.
And the other aspect of that I like is you can get the person's actual contact info and directly contact them. So there's no sort of intermediary there. And that's, again, that same spirit of trying to help users share the real data and not try to be too clever in the middle.
Yeah, the notion it's your job listing, not ours. So
really is a common theme across all these stories.
And how are you guys actually sharing those specific postings? Is this being done with a micro format, or is this just a regular post? Because there's been work, for example, on an HJob listing type thing or stuff like that.
Right now, it's just a normal post because it's generally not public content in the first place.
Okay.
But we do microformat a lot of our non-public stuff too, so that people that have browser toolbars and so forth.
Great.
So it would certainly make sense to do it there if there's an appropriate standard.
But at jobs.plaxo.com, I think anyone can take a look at it. So if it isn't microformatted, that's definitely it should be. Absolutely. The fourth story in the news.
Yeah. So this is actually sort of an interesting, addition to the story or to the Social Web TV episode that we had a couple weeks ago, where we wrote we didn't write, we performed perhaps an episode that was an open letter to the Obama administration, sort of suggesting ways in which they could adopt a lot of the social web technologies that we talk about here for government purposes, and essentially to serve citizens better. Well, it just so happened that on Friday, I received a phone call from someone from the Social Security Administration asking about OpenID, specifically how they might leverage it for government agency websites, to make it easier essentially for people to have or create accounts on government sites using accounts that they already have. Because essentially the government is not really set up in a position where they want to deal with all the password recovery stuff and all those strange things. And there are of course questions and concerns about privacy and security, but all the same, if you still require an email address to get a government service, let's say, or use a government website, well, you might as well use an OpenID as well. or instead. And so essentially that was what the conversation was about. So I'm not entirely sure what the next steps were, but my understanding is that this person was preparing a white paper to be presented to some of the higher ups who are actually very eager to see more transparency and openness within the government. So at the very least, there are people within the administration pushing this stuff forward, which I think is very exciting.
It's exciting. And if you think about the whole model of federated identity, which is essentially what OpenID is doing, there's no more common example than your social security number, right? It's an identifier in the social security database that so many other government databases and commercial databases and everything else refer to and key off of to know who you are, and that ties your identity across these different services, right? So it really is sort of the OpenID before there was OpenID in a sense, right?
Yeah,
Not quite as open,
Not as
perhaps,
open,
but
that's right.
ID certainly.
if you think of one part of the federal government reaching out to the community to get more informed about OpenID, Social Security Administration certainly is a logical and encouraging first
it would
step.
be
Department of Agriculture would also be nice, but not quite as high on the list. Right.
it would be a real shame, I think, if the government then developed their own technology, let's say, to do this.
Right.
And for example, if you wanted to integrate with government services, which I imagine will be possible or even plausible in the next several years, if you had to also implement support for whatever the government produces,
Right.
you can imagine the burden on web developers and website operators to do that. So it's at least exciting to see that perhaps they will reuse some of these building blocks that we've been working on.
I think if the government came out with a new technology for identity, they'd call it passport.
Oh,
Never mind. All right, that's enough news. Let's get into the discussion with
that's right.
Larry all about Ma.gnolia and some interesting topics there. But first, what the heck is Ma.gnolia for those few people out there who are not yet using it?
So Ma.gnolia is, or was, or will be in the future, a community and social bookmarking service. So it let you save the websites you were interested to the service rather than in your browser, and share them with other people and share them with other groups, and you could keep up with what other people on the service were looking at.
I was just saying, I think Ma.gnolia got very popular within certainly the sort of Silicon Valley crowd, if not, I'm sure other groups as well, just because there'd been other social bookmarking services, but it added a real design and a lot of extra nice features. You get little thumbnails of the page, and you get a lot of very helpful links there. And so I saw a lot of people, sort of a classic, we talk about that virtuous cycle of social discovery on the web. I think Ma.gnolia is a real success story there, where people started seeing bookmarks being shared that looked a lot nicer and cooler than the bookmarks they used to seeing being shared. It was like, whoa, what the hell is that? Let me check that out. And because it was easy to sign up, and in fact, you were one of the first OpenID relying parties, right? That a really good example of how people could discover it and start using it themselves, and round she goes.
Yeah, I mean, one of our guiding principles was we wanted to make our members look good, so that's...
Well, so it was certainly one of my favorite ways of sharing content into Plaxo. And then just a few weeks back, I went to the Ma.gnolia site to use it to share something, and I saw a really sad...
Right around the time something very bad happened,
Yes.
which is we had just catastrophic database corruption, and I had to take the site offline, and it has been down ever since.
And now you're out on the talk show circuit, sharing lessons learned and insights.
Right.
And I understand Oprah's next week.
I told her no.
But if you do want to hear more about
Letterman,
the details,
maybe.
if you do want to hear more about the details, Chris and Larry actually did a great little video podcast, kind of an addendum or a predecessor, or I don't know what you want to call it, to Social Web TV. And we'll link that up. You can find a lot more about that. I thought that was a really nice, kind of honest look at what happened and what the lessons are.
And Ma.gnolia will be returning in some form as at least starting out as a private invitation-driven system, as opposed to going right back to wide open public service. But I think one of the interesting things was that you brought up is a lot of the sort of open standards and technologies we adopted, and that sort of really relates back to the stuff we were talking about with Facebook. So in the midst of the ravaging fires of destruction that took away everyone's bookmarks, there was a lot of community contributed ideas and scripts and code, and also stuff that we were able to drive in-house that let people at least recover the public portions of their bookmark collections to varying degrees of success. Some people have reported they've gotten everything back. Some people have gotten very little back. But that was really possible because we wanted to format our data in a way and put it out there in a way that could be easily consumed by any other service that wanted to talk to us. So in addition to the standards of RSS, which has been around for years and years, we also adopted micro formats, and we had a couple of APIs running, one that mirrored the popular Delicious API and another that was OAuth protected, that sort of gave more rich data than you could get with the other one.
And you also allowed people to post their blogs and places like that.
So we were tools that would do automated blog posting. And so as Ma.gnolia went down, we were able to develop a bunch of tools that went out and gathered this information and reconstructed it into bookmark export files for people.
It's almost like a sci-fi novel of like you put these things in that your future self could then come back and read later and reconstruct after suffering amnesia.
So I mean, it gets.
Am I wrong?
I think that's really helped people to understand.
You're actually reading the daemon now, aren't you?
Yeah.
So, the idea of this, we would encounter the same thing. The idea of let's say someone, instead of us losing the database, somebody would come along and delete their Ma.gnolia account. They would, their Ma.gnolia account really wouldn't disappear. Anybody who had subscribed to their bookmarks or, even just sitting out there in Google's cache, all that information would be preserved and structured in such a way that it could be reconstituted into machine readable and interpretable formats.
Plus, there's this interesting angle too, which is the interconnectedness between these sites. So I was using Ma.gnolia, yes, to project publicly to some degree, but I was primarily interested in it going into Plaxo, which was useful for people I'm connected to discover things that are important to me, but also for me, because we keep an archive of that. So I have all of my stuff from the very beginning of my usage of Ma.gnolia in Plaxo and quite safe.
Sort of, yeah, and that's very similar to one of the first things people discovered was that if they were FriendFeed users, that FriendFeed had kept a copy of every bookmark they had made since they had created their FriendFeed account.
Now this actually gets right to the point that I think we wanted to address today, which is looking at this recent hubbub around the Facebook terms of service change and the reality of people using these services to do more and more sharing and to be more and more open, I guess, to use some of the parlance of Facebook. And I think in this case, you start to see why they needed to remove that section of the terms of service. Now, of course, they didn't communicate it very well, and they didn't talk about it in a way that I think people could understand and internalize and relate to those changes. But it goes to show that in this case, Ma.gnolia essentially went away. I mean, you essentially did, Control-Alt-Delete for the entire service.
Talk about what happens after you delete your account. These accounts were deleted with extreme prejudice.
RM-F, for like the web, right? So the difference, though, of course, is that in this case, it wasn't people going into their accounts and deleting their accounts. And so that's sort of very, very bad thing that happened. But what it demonstrates for everybody is, wow, there's a lot of this data that sort of is echoed out across the web. And just because my account on Ma.gnolia has been deleted or doesn't exist anymore, whether by my action or
an act of God.
Or an act of technology
Force
failure.
majeure.
That's right. The data still exists. And I think this is one of the problems that Facebook faces moving forward in the future as they try to get more sharing happening off-site, off of Facebook, is that they need to communicate to people, look, you can delete your instance of this stuff within Facebook, but for all those people with whom you've shared your data, they now have a copy of that stuff.
Right.
And even further, for those services that consume your data off of Facebook.com, where we have no essential sovereignty, let's say, those are all sovereign sort of websites, we cannot pull your data back. And so it's just like sort of
neither technically nor legally.
That's right. And so Mark Zuckerberg makes this point in his blog post around, well, it's just like if I send an email to someone and I delete it in my inbox, it doesn't get deleted in the other person's inbox.
Right.
And so if you imagine that concept applied to all social data, whether it's photos or bookmarks or videos and things like that, then you start to understand why Facebook can no longer make a promise that says, we will delete all the data that you've ever shared with us since the beginning if you delete your account, because it's just not feasible.
And as we become smarter about how we share that data, I think it's like an argument for doing things smarter, like microformats, where you're actually structuring the data in useful ways. And I think, it's an interesting comparison of Plaxo versus FriendFeed, where in FriendFeed, friend feed had a very generic sort of least common denominator version of everybody's bookmarks. They could basically get a title and link back. Whereas in Plaxo, you had a much smarter representation of someone's bookmark.
Which is about fidelity.
Yeah,
Right.
Fidelity, that as we become smarter, I mean, not only will that data be more long-lived, it will degrade less. It will be less degraded
That's why I call
information.
microformats the vinyl of the web.
Yeah.
Well, and it speaks to the activity streams project we've spoken about on previous episodes too.
Yeah.
How do you capture that fidelity in a way that it is easy for it to be preserved as it goes around the web, because it's so important to really keep that, and you don't want to have a world where interoperability means forcing everyone to the lowest common denominator. Quite the contrary, you want exactly cases like Ma.gnolia, where something like the basics of social bookmarking were fairly standardized, but then they came in and added some new innovative flourishes, and you really want that to be able to ride on top of what everybody else was already used to.
Yeah.
And at the risk of using the term watershed moment too many times in one few month period, I think the Facebook TOS debate in many ways is a watershed moment. This document back here, the Bill of Rights for Use of the Social Web, that was created, September of 2007, in many ways was meant to start framing that discussion.
Exactly.
And in many ways, the market wasn't yet ready for that.
Yeah.
And in January of 2008, when Plaxo built a Facebook importer that created a brouhaha that was eventually called Scobelgate, again, there was a big debate, but the market was not yet ready for understanding that when I share something with you, I'm sharing it with you, and if you want to sync it with Outlook or
That's your
keep a
call,
copy,
not mine.
I've given you that in some way that is more significant than I've lent it to you on a choke chain.
Well, before it was also about Facebook sort of being the parent in the situation and overlooking the relationship and saying, we know better than you, and so we're going to put email addresses as images.
Right.
Because you can't trust your friends with your data. And I think that the change that's happening is that people are realizing, well, actually, I want to be able to say who I trust and who I don't trust, and I don't want a service like Facebook to tell me who I trust and not. And that, of course, means going through the adolescent period of being able to take the car out at night, and well, they might crash it and they might have some problems, but that's part of the learning process. And so we're sort of growing up now, I think, in the social web, where people are starting to maybe have more sophistication around the understandings of data privacy and protection, and a whole new generation, I think, is going to emerge that understands these things very viscerally. And if they put it on the web, there is always that case that it could leak.
Right.
But they're very intentional about what they put on the web as a result of that.
I think that's the point, because what makes this such a difficult issue is everybody understands in the real world that once I give you my business card, it's yours and I can't break into your house and take it back. And if you do something funky with it, that's your call, and there's a social contract there that is the only protection.
If I put your business card in a fishbowl at the coffee shop, you trusted me with that.
But there's this sort of idealistic hope on the web that it could be different, that somehow I could have my own master copy of my data and everybody else could see it, but I couldn't maintain complete control over it because it's digital. And I think the reality is just that the digital world, when you really spaghetti it out across mobile phones and different services and tools, is as messy as the real world. And the danger, I think, is if you try to help maintain this fantasy that you always are in control, people may not learn the responsibility. They have a false sense of security, right? And so ultimately, even though obviously it's painful for people to hear, you might not be able to get that back once you've put it out. Ultimately, it seems like the only way forward is to say you do still have to take some responsibility, and these tools can help and maybe give you more control than you ever had before, but it's still, you can't always put the genie back in the bottle, and you just have to, as Scott McNally says, get over it.
Well, to Magnolia's, point of the service, I think, it's going to become more and more about sort of real-time data, or real-time plus a little bit more, but of the moment data is going to become what's more interesting. And so a lot of people are saying, it sucks that I lost my bookmarks and Magnolia went away. But really, I want to use Magnolia again. I want the service back. I want that publishing tool back.
And on that positive note, I note that we're out of time. I want to thank our guest, Larry Halff, for joining us.
Thank you. That was great.
And yes, another watershed moment has passed. But join us next week for another one and another exciting episode of the Social Web TV.